Hello everyone, and I'm Autobot Sonic the Telltale Gamer, bringing latest everything Telltale Games, Transformers, and more. So here we are with the second last review I will ever do of Cyberverse, as we now have arrived at the final season of Cyberverse, if you even want to call 2 episodes a final season. But considering that each of these episodes is over 40 minutes long, I guess you can chalk it up to this being essentially, don't think of it as a 2-episode season. You can think of it instead as sort of an 8-episode season, considering that every episode of Cyberverse is usually 10 minutes long. So just think of it as an 8-episode season instead of a 2-episode one. So for this review, we're going to be looking at Transformers Cyberverse Season 4, Episode 1, The Immobilizers, or Part 1 of the 2-part finale event, whatever you want to call it. And honestly, even though I was fine with Season 3, if that was the final episode of Cyberverse, I would be okay with that was the end. This episode of Cyberverse, honestly, is pretty funny, and I really had a good time with this episode, even though I did have a few problems with it. And I gotta say, I understand that this episode focuses on Grimlock, because at this time, Hasbro had already put out the new Dinobot toys for the Cyberverse line, so they wanted to try to find a way to incorporate the Dinobots into the Cyberverse cartoon. So, I understand the need for that, and while I believe that's the second episode of Season 4 that actually acts as the true series finale to the show, I do believe that the Immobilizers, this episode, despite it basically being a tie-in cash grab for the rest of the Dinobots, is a pretty good episode, and also gives Grimlock another chance to shine a spotlight after his last 2 times being in Season 1 with Episode 15, King of the Dinosaurs, and Episode, I believe, 17 of Season 2 with Perfect Storm, where he and RC had their own little misadventures on the Ark. So I'm always happy to see more Grimlock content in an episode where he actually has a spotlight. So, because it was kind of getting boring or annoying seeing Grimlock take the spotlight in episodes that weren't about him. But now to have a whole episode, well, or technically 4 episodes dedicated to Grimlock in a row, honestly, this was a great episode. So we're going to go ahead and see everything this episode did right and what it did wrong. So Episode 1, The Immobilizer, starts out for just very similar faction to Perfect Storm back in Season 2, with RC and Grimlock in another misadventure. This time they're looting I believe it's the Tomb of Nexus Prime, trying to get like several artifacts from it, and they're running away from this apparently large invisible bird that's hurtling like eggs at them all the time. Now, I don't know if this is like a actual thing that they decided to just make the bird invisible for laughs, or maybe because the Cyberverse team couldn't have time to design a whole brand new like bird model just for this one episode, so they just said it was invisible to save money. But I understand if that was the case, but it just seems kind of awkward that they're being chased by an invisible bird of all things. So despite this though, they're able to escape by the skin of their teeth and basically go over all the loot that they've collected. And as Grimlock's just listing off everything to RC, they managed to find that one of the objects that they looted from the tomb is the Enigma of Combination, which of course, if you read the first IDW comics, or even the current IDW comics, or the original Prime Wars Machinima series that came out about 5 years ago, you'll know, of course, that the Enigma Combination is a new invention in the Transformers mythos that essentially allows for combiners to happen, where if a group of Transformers touch the Enigma, they'll be forced into a combiner form. Though RC and Grimlock don't exactly know this, believing that the Enigma Combination is, as the name implies, an enigma, so they decide to stow it away as little party favors to give out during a post-treaty party that Grimlock's going to be hosting at Cybertron. So obviously this takes place quite a bit of a ways after the events of the Season 3 finale, the other one, where after Bumblebee and Optimus defeated Megatron X, and Peace seemingly returned to Cybertron after they restored Windblade. Things have just seemed to simmer down now that even after Megatron X's defeat. It's also at this point that we get our intro for Transformers Cyberverse Season 4, or I assume it's for the entirety of this season. They may change it for the next episode, considering that this episode seems to wrap up the plot focused in the opening really nicely. But if this is the final opening for Cyberverse, I'm totally okay with that, because this is actually a pretty good opening, and it's actually an extended one compared to the ones that we've gotten in Seasons 1 through 3, though it's interesting as though it sort of is not only does it contain new stuff, but also it has a remix of stuff from older intros. So first off, the opening of the Season 4 opening is pretty much the same as Seasons 1 through 3. We have the silhouettes of Bumblebee and Windblade, followed by Optimus and Megatron staring down each other with the Allspark opening, though in Season 1, we had all the Seekers coming out of Space Bridge, and then it shows Bumblebee's memories, with it focusing on memory of Starscream. Season 2, when the Allspark opened, it showed Starscream getting this upgrade from the Allspark armor and being surrounded by Hot Rod, RC, Lockdown, Cheetor, and Wheeljack. For Season 3, we had the Quintessent drone being surrounded by Optimus, Megatron, Dark Hot Rod, Clobber, and Dead End. But now for Season 4, we actually have a remixed version of the Season 1 opening to start off at first, where we have the Seekers come out of the ground bridge again, though this time as it goes through Bumblebee's memories, I believe it's Chromia, Grimlock, and McAdam that are still there like they were back in Season 1. But instead of Starscream, it's now Soundwave that's the primary memory that's being focused on, which seems to imply, like, it's really into the fact that now Soundwave is in control of the Decepticons after Megatron was killed by Megatron X at the end of Season 3. So I think that was a cool little touch to point out that essentially Soundwave is in control of Decepticons now, which is also a nice little reference to the IDW comics where, while Megatron doesn't exactly die in that comic, Soundwave does end up taking control of the Decepticons after a certain event that happens in the IDW comics, in the first batch of IDW comics, I should say. But the opening doesn't end right there. Before it cuts to the usual shot of Bumblebee and several other Autobots coming out of Space Bridge and Bumblebee stabbing punching the screen with his stinger. Instead, it cuts to all of the Dinobots, including Grimlock, running along individual tracks that are in the middle of space outside of Cybertron. And I gotta say, the soundtrack that plays while they're all running out and the silhouettes that are shown in here, it's really, really cool to see just how epic this looks, honestly. I can't think of any better words for it. But as they're running, they all suddenly converge on another and then combine into Volcanicus, who is the combiner form that all the Dinobots take later on this episode. Though for the most part, Volcanicus' form is silhouetted to hide the fact of what he actually looks like in the final version. Though we get this cool effect where he essentially pulls out a sword made of fire and swings it around several silhouettes of what appear to be frozen Autobots and Decepticons, which again plays into the plot of this episode. And as Volcanicus slashes at the screen, it then cuts back to the normal ending of the openings with showing the now alive Cybertron instead of the dead Cybertron we saw back in seasons 1 through 3. This time Cybertron is alive as well, and Bumblebee just pops up with the whole Transformers Bumblebee Cyberverse Adventures logo. So honestly, if I had to say what my favorite opening is of each of Cyberverse seasons, I had to say probably Season 4. I really do like this one, though Season 3 is a very close second, and then Season 2 after that, and Season 1 probably the least favorite. They've just constantly gotten better and better with these openings, and I'm glad to see that this is, like, honestly their best one so far. So I'm really hoping, though, we get a different one for the final episode, but if they don't, that's totally fine by me. After the opening, we cut to the real start of this episode, the Mobilizers, in which we basically start with a parade, and before you all get nervous that we're just gonna go through a whole nother parade loop like we did with the first, like, 5 to 10 episodes of Season 3 Cyberverse, no, this is a true parade, but I do like the parallels here in that it kind of pays homage to the parades that the Autobots and Decepticons went through during their loops back during the Quintessent arc. It reminds me a lot of that. So, several other Autobots and Decepticons that are all just going around doing their own thing, celebrating a peace treaty that has finally been brokered between the Autobots and Decepticons, putting an end to the war for Cybertron after thousands upon thousands of years. And there's the few little Easter eggs here that I think are really, really cool for both Cyberverse fans and Transformers fans in general. The first of which is one thing of Rack and Ruin selling out foam fingers to everyone, which is a nice little callback to how in the actual Autobot loop back in Season 3, Rack and Ruin was selling foam fingers during then as well. But the coolest Easter egg here, in my opinion, is something that I'm sure a lot of people and other fellow YouTubers who reviewed this episode pointed out, and is that in this one segment where it seems to be there's like a little booth for a Save the Singlehorns, like, charity thing, there are a few data pads here, and if you read the data pads, if you translate them from Cybertronian text to English, the English text actually translates to list off several popular and, like, just random Transformers YouTubers who have reviewed Cyberverse over the past 5 years, thanking them for reviewing Cyberverse over the past few years. And honestly, I think that's such a cool concept. You have people like Comet and Cam, Rodimus Primal, Key and Carlisle, a lot of those cool people, and it's actually this Easter egg that convinced me to get me back into reviewing Cyberverse. And I'm not doing it because, oh, I just want to do these reviews because I want the Cyberverse writers to put me in, like, put me in as an Easter egg in a future Transformers show. No, I swear to God, I swear I'm not that petty, I swear to God. I just thought, I'm like, wow, that's really cool, and honestly, like, that just kind of gave me the motivation I needed to get back into reviewing Cyberverse. So, for all you guys like Comet and Cam and everyone else who got into, who are now basically immortalized in Transformers Cyberverse here, basically with the crew thanking you all for doing all these reviews. That's so cool, and hopefully, maybe things get lucky. Maybe I too will one day get immortalized in the Transformers show, but one can dream. Anyway, though, as the parade continues, we see that basically Optimus, I believe it's Optimus, Wheeljack, and Hot Rod and Bumblebee are on the Autobot side. Oh, and Windblades. Optimus, Bumblebee, Windblade, and maybe Hot Rod are on the Autobot side. And then we have Shadow Striker, Soundwave, and I believe, I want to say Lockdown maybe on the Decepticon side. Basically, both of them are getting ready to sign a joint peace treaty that will end the war, with Soundwave now taking control of the Decepticons after Megatron was killed at the end of the other one back in Season 3. However, just as both Optimus and Soundwave are about to go ahead and basically sign or approve the treaty, suddenly this big green, energy wave comes down from the sky and immediately freezes everyone. And I mean everyone, I mean everyone. Not just at the parade, but everyone on Cybertron, including, just random animals, are all frozen. The entire planet is just literally time-locked. Dio pulled out the Worldo and froze everyone. It's crazy. But anyway, thankfully, though, Grimlock and RC, though, were still off-world looting the Tomb of Zeta Prime when this happens, so they're not affected by a time loop. And when they get back, they notice that all the Autobot Decepticons are frozen. So they try to figure out how they're gonna go ahead and figure this out, which is also very similar to their last episode together, which was Perfect Storm, which also revolved around them trying to save the Ark when every single Autobot was frozen by a solar storm that they had run into. So I thought that was a nice little callback to Perfect Storm in that regards. So eventually, Grimlock and RC decide to split up and investigate different areas about trying to figure out what's caused all the Autobot Decepticons to get frozen. And here's where we get introduced to our main antagonist for this episode, and that is a group of mercenary Transformers. Now, the mercenary Transformers are actually a sort of brand new faction that was sort of been introduced only in the last, 3 years or so, and that they've been exclusive to toys, and as far as I know, through toys and the recent War for Cybertron Netflix series, specifically in Chapter 2, Earthrise. But the mercenary Transformers are essentially sort of like a neutral faction of Transformers that essentially they're not really aligned with the Autobots or Decepticons, though they mostly are comprised of former Decepticons, essentially just to have a vendetta against both the Autobots and Decepticons. So in this case, our group of mercenaries consists of several characters who are both recolors of several characters that we already know in Cyberverse, but also are callbacks to other incarnations of these older versions of these characters. So leading the mercenaries is this bot named Sound Blaster, who of course is just a black and red Soundwave, and of course Sound Blaster has been in many different things, usually as a clone of Soundwave. So I really do like that Sound Blaster appears in this. I think he does play as an interesting, he's kind of an entertaining main villain, but he's also different from Soundwave. He's not just a carbon copy of Soundwave, he does have his own personality and such. And unlike Soundwave, who was voiced by Mark Swint in Cyberverse, Sound Blaster, on the other hand, is voiced by Mark Thompson, who also voiced Megatron and Skybite in Cyberverse. So it's interesting to see that Mark Thompson voices Sound Blaster, because when I first heard him with that heavy southern accent, I thought this was Rich Orlau using his Wow Wheel voice to voice Sound Blaster. But no, it's actually Mark Thompson doing a very, very convincing Western accent. I gotta say, he does a good job of it, but I'm not sure if it exactly fits Sound Blaster, but I do appreciate that they make him so unique compared to Soundwave, and not just make him a carbon copy of Soundwave like the War for Cybertron trilogy did. Alongside Sound Blaster are various other goons. These include a black and white version of Bumblebee named Bugbite, who is based off the Shattered Glass version of Bumblebee, Nightbird, who is basically a recolor of RC, but is of course based off the G1 character Nightbird, who was sort of a human-created Autobot, plans to essentially be like an ally to Autobots, but end up being converted into a Decepticon by Megatron. This time, instead of Nightbird just being a mindless drone, she's actually her own character, who's also voiced by Jamie Lamchick, who is the voice of RC and Chromia. So I think that's cool to see, basically, Jamie Lamchick play essentially a evil, more serious version of RC. But honestly, I really like Cyberverse Nightbird. I think she's a cool character. And then finally, rounding out the crew of mercenaries, we have Afterburner, who is just a random seeker, voiced by Rich Orlau, who also voices Thunder Howl, Meteor Fire, and Wild Wheel back in Season 3. And we have Double Crosser, who is a red and purple version of Rack and Ruin, who is voiced by Ryan Andes, who also voices Grimlock and Shockwave. And honestly, I like how all these characters, while they do share the same designs as other characters, like with Bugbite being just a recolor of Bumblebee, Double Crosser being a recolor of Rack and Ruin, they each have their own distinct personalities to make them different from one another. I'm especially very fond of Bugbite, who is also voiced by Mark Thompson, like Sound Blaster, and I love how his personality just is totally unlike Bumblebee's, and really makes him stand out as his own character, despite the fact that he's literally just a black and white Bumblebee with red eyes. I really do like Bugbite. He's probably my favorite out of all the mercenaries. Anyway, shortly after we're introduced to all these mercenaries, RC does manage to catch up to them after being caught, after she catches them all. And while she's holding up with her minigun, trying to convince them all to unfreeze all the Autobots, Sound Blaster decides not to, and instead pulls out this freeze ray gun. And by freeze ray, I not mean an ice gun, like a literal gun that freezes you in place. So he shoots RC with this, causing her to become frozen as well, like everyone else, unbeknownst to Grimlock. And so they all leave, but just as eventually Grimlock though does manage to find her. And anyway though, once Grimlock gets RC, he tries to find where Sound Blaster and all the other mercenaries went, but they're nowhere to be found. But it's at this point where he suddenly hears what appears to be shouting coming from another rooftop. And when he goes up there though, he finds not the mercenaries led by Sound Blaster, but a group of Dinobots who seem to be arguing, and that's where we get introduced to the Dinobots finally properly in Cyberverse, with them being Snarl, Swoop, Sludge, and Slug. And honestly, Snarl, Swoop, and Sludge are kind of forgettable. I do like their designs though as Dinobots. Swoop though is honestly the biggest, my favorite out of all of them, and it's the fact that Swoop is so radically different from other versions of the character. The first off, being that Cyberverse Swoop, unlike every other version of Swoop, is actually female instead of being male like every other version of the character. And Swoop, honestly, I really like her design in Cyberverse. I like that she's kind of like, sort of like the nerdy tech girl, like reminds me a lot of a Mei from My Hero Academia, if anyone watches that anime. The way Swoop talks and how like matter-of-fact she is, she reminds me a lot of Mei from My Hero Academia, and that is only furthered by her voice actress, Lori Himes, who does an absolutely great job of voicing Swoop. And as far as I know, this is actually her very first role in Cyberverse, and it may very well be her only role, considering there's only one more episode. I mean, it could be possible that Swoop does show up again in episode 2, but if not, though, I think Lori Himes absolutely kills it as Swoop. She's definitely the standout character in this episode, in my opinion, in terms of, like, brand new characters we get introduced to. So Grimlock is confused as to why all the Dinobots are here and basically why they look like him. And it's at this point that Swoop, I think it's Swoop and Snarl, that explain that the Dinobots come from another planet where they had apparently received Grimlock's message that he recorded with his dinosaur friends all the way back in Season 1, Episode 15, King of the Dinosaurs, that essentially they became inspired by Grimlock to try and fight back against the mercenaries and try and protect their own planet. And it's at this point where Swoop explains to Grimlock that before him, they had another leader who had the same alt mode as Grimlock as a T-Rex, and his name was Tiny Arms, apparently. But unfortunately, Tiny Arms was killed by Sound Blaster and the rest of the mercenaries when they ended up destroying their home world after they had frozen everyone on the planet, which leaves Swoop, Snarl, Slug, and Sludge as the sole survivors. So basically, the Dinobots have been traveling the world, traveling the galaxy, looking for Grimlock to see if they can try and meet up with him and finally put a stop to Soundwave, not Soundwave, to Sound Blaster and everyone else. So Grimlock agrees to let them let them accompany him on their quest to basically take down Sound Blaster after that. So after a bit, Grimlock and the rest of the Dinobots do manage to catch up to Sound Blaster and the rest of them mercenaries, who are currently, I believe, in the process of stealing a bunch of stuff from various different Autobots and Decepticons that are being frozen. And while Grimlock initially tells all of the Dinobots to hang back because he wants to take them out himself, Grimlock decides to go ahead and tries to solo all of the mercenaries. And for a while, though, it seems as though he actually does have the upper hand. But for a moment where it seems like he's losing, the Dinobots get worried for him, and despite Swoop saying otherwise, the rest of the Dinobots do decide to charge in and try to help Grimlock. But before they get in, Grimlock does manage to turn it around, but of course is taken by surprise when all the other Dinobots jump in and sort of make him lose his concentration, allowing Sound Blaster and the rest of the mercenaries to take the upper hand. So I think they end up managing to beat Grimlock and the rest of the Dinobots. They retreat inside a shuttle that Grimlock and RC took to get onto Cybertron back in the start of this episode. So it's at this point that Grimlock is essentially berating the Dinobots, trying to get them to listen to him more and basically truly treat him as their king. When I think it's Slug or Sludge who is rummaging through all the Zeta Prime artifacts that he and RC had uncovered at the beginning of this episode, when he eventually comes across the Enigma combination, and all the other Dinobots are crowded around it when Grimlock tells him to stop messing with it. So he for some reason leaves the pilot's seat to go ahead and tries to pull the Enigma away from them, but because he forgot to set the shuttle on autopilot, the ship starts to spiral out of control. But all of a sudden, all the Dinobots combine into their ultimate combiner form of Volcanicus and end up causing the shuttle to explode and crash onto the surface. Though when they land, they do find themselves transformed back into their individual parts. So Grimlock is confused as to what exactly just happened. So Swoop decides that she can consult her Witwicky, and yes, that is a reference to, of course, Spike Witwicky from the G1 cartoon, and of course Sam Witwicky from the Bayverse movies, to basically explain what the Enigma combination is. So on this Wiki, which apparently was, according to the writers of Cyberverse, they were originally going to straight up call it the TF Wiki as an homage to the actual Transformers Wiki that's online. The Enigma combination, they learn, is essentially as it is in the IDW comics and the Prime Wars Machinima series, an artifact that allows any 5 Transformers, or just any number of Transformers, who touch it to merge into one strong combiner unit. So Grimlock becomes intrigued by this and tries to get everyone to try touching it again to transform. It's at this point they transform into Volcanicus once again, but they can't even manage to take one step without even falling down and just splitting apart again. So it's at this point we get this very cute little training montage where Grimlock puts together like this training course for all of them to work through as Volcanicus. And I gotta say though, with Volcanicus' voice actor, it's not like his voice is an amalgamation of Mark Thompson, Rich Orlau, Ryan Andes, and Laurie Himes all speaking together. Instead of like Volcanicus' voice being like all 4 of them together, Volcanicus is actually voiced by another voice actor named, I believe his name is Ryan Nichols. But honestly, I can't say that Volcanicus' voice is really fitting for him. Now don't get me wrong, I think Ryan Nichols does a great job of voicing Volcanicus. I just don't think the way his voice sounds, it's a good fit for Volcanicus. Because the way I think of Volcanicus, he to me sounds like he should be a lot more authoritative. Maybe they should have just gotten Ryan Andes to do his Grimlock voice again, or maybe just do some sort of synthesizer voice where it's with Ryan Andes, Mark Thompson, and Rich Orlau, all of them like talking over each other, kind of similar to like, let's say Dragon Ball Z when Goku and Vegeta fuse into Vegito and you kind of have both their voices overlapping over each other. I think that would be a pretty cool thing to do if they did do that, but unfortunately they don't do that. So Volcanicus' voice just sounds a little bit too, I guess, young or naive. That's just how I feel. But eventually, though, Volcanicus does learn to function as a proper combiner, and as a reward, they end up managing to get a sort of, pull out a flame sword from their back, which sort of channels in Grimlock's own ability to breathe fire. So I do like that little callback to that. And I think Volcanicus' design, though, despite my grievances with his voice, does fit very well. I think Volcanicus' design fits properly and is really cool considering how all the Dinobots combine to form Volcanicus. Like they even have their own like Voltron combining sequence that I think is really, really cool to see. So I'll give the transformation sequence and just Volcanicus' overall design like a 10 out of 10 because I absolutely love it. Now, once Grimlock and the rest of the Dinobots learn how to properly function together as a team combined as Volcanicus, they try to think of a plan to how they're going to take down Sound Blaster and the rest of the mercenaries when Sound Blaster has his freezing gun to basically time freeze everyone. And it's at this point that Swoop decides that she's going to go ahead and create a sort of shield that can counteract or negate the effects of the time freeze gun. So after collecting several materials from around Cybertron and various people who are frozen, they do manage to form the shield, but it's way too big for Atom to carry. So that basically causes Grimlock to consider having them all combine to Volcanicus and just have him pick up the shield to use as sort of like a one-handed sword and shield combo to use with their flame sword already. And I gotta say, the way Volcanicus looks with both the Time Freeze shield and his flame sword, I honestly really dig the design here, and it reminds me a lot of more so of IDW Grimlock, especially with his own flame sword that he had in those comics. And even currently with the current, I believe IDW is doing like a mini series called King Grimlock, where he has that flame sword as well. It reminds me a lot of that, and I really dig it. So now armed with both the Time Freeze shield and their flame sword, Volcanicus decides they're going to go ahead and now take on Sound Blaster and his mercenaries to save Cybertron. Meanwhile, though, before they even get there, we do cut back to Sound Blaster, Bugbite, and the rest of the mercenaries who are currently in the process of looting everyone from the main parade. Like, we see them all go up to the main like platform where Optimus, Windblade, and Soundwave are, and they each take different stuff from all of them. Like Nightbird ends up taking Windblade's Stormfall sword to use as her own, but the main thing here though is that Sound Blaster takes Soundwave, decides that he's going to go ahead and get some revenge on Soundwave that we don't know about. So using his Time Freeze gun, Sound Blaster manages to unfreeze Soundwave's head, but only his head. The rest of his body is still frozen, and this causes Soundwave to wonder who Sound Blaster is, which really angers Sound Blaster, who seems to have really got some sort of vendetta against Soundwave, considering in past incarnations, Sound Blaster has always felt inferior to Soundwave because of the fact that he was a clone created from Soundwave. But in this case, though, according to Nightbird, Sound Blaster's backstory in Cyberverse is a lot different. So we flash back to what is presumably the early days of the Cybertronian War, where for some reason we have all of the Decepticons inside McAdams, where Soundwave and Sound Blaster are engaging in a beatboxing competition between one another. And I swear to God, I am not making this up. Soundwave and Sound Blaster legit get into a beatboxing competition with one another, where Soundwave beats Sound Blaster so badly, Megatron just straight up humiliates Sound Blaster in front of all the other Decepticons, and this became so humiliating for Sound Blaster that he just straight up left the Decepticons after that. And honestly, I think it's funny, and it fits with Cyberverse being sort of a kid-friendly show that, haha, Sound Blaster feels inferior to Soundwave because he lost to him in a beatboxing competition. But it just feels kind of silly that Sound Blaster would go this far just for some petty revenge trick just because Soundwave beat him in a beatboxing competition. But anyway, Sound Blaster's ultimate punishment for Soundwave is to go ahead and put Soundwave in sort of this like infinite frequency trap, I believe it's called, that whenever Soundwave makes a sound or speaks, that sound will infinitely reverberate inside the prison, which causes immense pain to Soundwave. And along with that, though, he also takes away Laserbeak from him, which really angers Soundwave. And honestly, Sound Blaster, my man, you're doing all this just because, though, he beat you in a beatboxing competition? I don't know, this is the kind of same levels of pettiness I saw from Starscream back in Season 1 when he, because he didn't go on a good date with Windblade, he decided he was going to go ahead and sabotage the Cube game so that no one could have fun with it. Like, honestly, it's funny, but it just seems extremely petty in my opinion, but I do like the humor of it. Before Sound Blaster, though, can fully enact his revenge and kill Soundwave inside his, like, sound reverberation trap, Volcanicus does come up challenging Sound Blaster and the rest of the mercenaries to battle him in exchange for letting all these Cybertronians go free. But Sound Blaster denies this and just straight up starts attacking Volcanicus. And we get this kind of entertaining fight where Volcanicus is just trying to keep up with all the mercenaries who are just so much smaller than him. But eventually, though, Volcanicus does manage to overpower them all. And I gotta say, I honestly really do like the fight scene between Volcanicus and all the mercenaries. Kind of shows just how far all the Dinobots have come from working together at the start of this episode, which is really helped by the fact that this is a 40-minute episode as opposed to the usual 10 to 11 minutes that we usually get per episode. So it's like, I think one-fourth of this episode is spent on the fight between Volcanicus and Sound Blaster's goons, and honestly, it's a really fun fight. But eventually, though, Volcanicus does manage to overpower Sound Blaster and everyone else and traps them inside this little cage that Sound Blaster was using to basically store all the junk that they had stolen from all the Autobots and Decepticons that they had frozen. And so it just seems that it seems like all's done and well. They can just grab the unfreeze gun and find a way to unfreeze everyone. But before they can do that, they're actually stopped by Sound Blaster's boss, who we saw a little bit of a teaser of earlier on this episode when Sound Blaster contacted them, but we never actually saw them in full. Here, though, we finally learn who Sound Blaster's boss is, just as all the Dinobots end up decombining, and we find out that their boss is none other than Trypticon, the large Dinobot triple changer that has been frequently used by the Decepticons in many different Transformers continuities as a sort of like triple changer, as both like a shuttle and also like a Decepticon airbase. In the Alliance continuity, for instance, the Nemesis was actually the alt mode of Trypticon, so that's like a little fun fact for anyone who wasn't aware of that in Transformers Prime. But honestly, Trypticon's personality in Cyberverse is not what I was expecting at all, because Trypticon, for lack of terms, is essentially the Transformers equivalent of Godzilla. He's this huge black dinosaur that just goes around destroying everything. But the way he speaks and acts, he seems like he's just trying to be some uptight boss, where he essentially considers Sound Blaster and everyone else his faithful employees that just do whatever he wants them to do. And Grimlock is just as confused as I was listening to this. There's just like one point where Grimlock just gives out a flat what to Trypticon upon hearing his explanation for everything, and literally I just shouted out what out loud the exact same time Grimlock did, and I laughed so hard because Trypticon's appearance in Cyberverse is totally unlike anything we've ever seen before in another version of Trypticon, but I absolutely love it. I think it's hilarious in the context of this, even though it makes no sense for Trypticon of all mechs to have this personality. But after the initial shock wears off, Trypticon essentially explains that the way it worked was that Sound Blaster and his group would go ahead and freeze all the life forms on a planet and steal everything of value for the planet, while Trypticon would basically be allowed to go ahead and just stomp all over the planet and destroy it. So that's what Trypticon plans to do with Cybertron, essentially just stomp around and destroy the whole planet just to cause mayhem and be a jerk like that, essentially. So Grimlock's not having any of that, and once again has everyone combined again to form Volcanicus. And this is something that's really cool, where we have the fight between Volcanicus and Trypticon. It honestly feels like a true kaiju battle, especially with Volcanicus shooting fire at Volcanicus, who manages to block it with a shield, with the time-free shield, but because it's only meant to block time-free stuff and not actual fire, the whole shield does melt. But thankfully Volcanicus inherited Grimlock's resistance to fire, so he's not affected by it. And it's really cool, like, how they fight each other straight up like a kaiju fight. But eventually Trypticon does get the upper hand and manages to hit Volcanicus with his tail so hard it causes him to decombine back into Grimlock and all the other Dinobots. But this isn't the end, because Grimlock and all the Dinobots do manage to turn it around, thankfully. Eventually Grimlock starts like jumping on top of Trypticon, biting onto various pieces of him, while Swoop and the rest of the Dinobots look around for the freeze gun that Sound Blaster had, until Swoop locates it at the Save a Single Horn booth that I mentioned back at the beginning of this review. So Swoop manages to grab it, and at the very last second shoots Trypticon with it, just as he's about to stomp down on Grimlock, I believe, and freezes him, basically finally winning the battle. But they're unsure of how exactly they're going to use the unfreeze gun to freeze every single Cybertronian on Cybertron, though Grimlock says that there's a quicker way to do it. So they just go ahead and use the gun to unfreeze Wheeljack, who basically creates an enhancer for the gun to unfreeze everyone and every living thing on Cybertron. So with that, basically everyone is now able to continue with the party, and the treaty is signed ending the Cybertronian War. All the Dinobots are welcomed as Autobots by Optimus and Grimlock, and that's pretty much it. It's honestly, not much happens in this episode. I mean, we do get stuff like the introduction of Volcanicus and the Enigma combination, but for this being the second last episode of Cyberverse, I understand this was kind of just made to sell the idea of Trypticon and all the Dinobots to people who want to buy these toys. But it's honestly just a harmless, fun episode, and even if it doesn't get anything accomplished, I did enjoy this episode. And so that was my review of Transformers Cyberverse Season 4, Episode 1, The Immobilizers. If I had to rate this episode, honestly, I'd probably give it an 8 or 8.5 out of 10. It was a great little, like, fun filler episode. Like, I can't even call it filler. It's kind of like a bonus episode if you want to call it that, because really, the show ended with Season 3. This is kind of just like a little bonus, like a cherry on top for all the Cyberverse fans who just couldn't get enough Grimlock, because Grimlock's time was a little bit limited, and I know I complained a lot back in Seasons 3 and 2 of just Grimlock taking up too much screen time, but honestly, it's cool to have Grimlock get a truly dedicated episode to himself, and the way he bounces off all the other Dinobots, especially Swoop, who was a great character. I absolutely loved her design and the rest of the Dinobots, how they formed a Volcanicus, and the little trials they went through to try and work together as Volcanicus. I think Sound Blaster and his group of mercenaries, especially Bugbite, were really funny characters to hang out with, and I really enjoyed seeing them on screen. And finally, the final fight with Volcanicus and the Dinobots versus Trypticon was really, really fun to watch. But at the same time, though, there were some things I just had a problem with, like Snarl, Sludge, and Slug being the same character almost. Sound Blaster and Volcanicus' voice is not really fitting how I imagine him to be. And then Trypticon, for as funny as it is, as his character was, it just didn't feel like Trypticon in my opinion, so that's where the point and a half comes off. But overall, though, it was a really fun episode, and I'm glad this happened. But that's going to be it for this review. I'll be back very, very soon with, unfortunately, the final review of Cyberverse, and not just Season 4, but the entire show, with the series finale of Season 4 and the entire show, Season 4, Episode 2, The Perfect Decepticon. I'm not ready to say goodbye to this show, but I hope you guys are ready for the final review of Cyberverse, because I am so excited to finally go ahead and talk about it. If you're excited as I am for the final review of Cyberverse, be sure to like, comment, and of course subscribe, and I will see you guys later. Take it away, Bumblebee.
Bumblebee out.
And I might know what our future